Welcome to Human Tech, a podcast about the intersection between humans and technology. My name is Guthrie. I'm here with Susan. Hi, Susan.
Hello, Guthrie. I'm here.
Yes, you are. And what is our topic today?
You know, I thought we would talk about. Well, I think it's interesting, but I guess the title isn't very interesting. Maybe you can help me come up with a better title. Here's the scene.
I thought your title was just fine.
You did?
Yes.
Okay. Presenting research results to stakeholders.
I think that's a very clear title that makes lots of sense.
But it's not exciting.
Yeah, I suppose it's not exciting. Yes, I suppose so.
Yeah. Be a superhero? No. Okay, so the idea is that for anybody who does any kind of user or customer research, whether you're in marketing or user experience or whatever, something you have to do a lot of, and you've done this, we've done this together on projects with clients. You did this research, whatever you did, you did interviews, you did field studies, observations, you did a user test, you did card sorting, and now you have all this data, you analyze all the data, you come up with your insights and your recommendations, and now you have to present this to them. And I think what some people may not realize is that these decisions you make around presenting, like how much detail do you present, how much data do you show them, and so on, can really be very significant in whether or not your results are accepted, whether they have impact, and so on. So,
right.
I was putting together some thoughts for actually a client about how to do this more effectively, and I thought I would share that.
Awesome.
Okay. So, first of all, the reason
very popular topic.
You think?
Well, we get requested. I feel like people request this
topic.
Well, now you also wrote a book that's somewhat similar.
Well, I wrote a book on 100 things every presenter needs to know about people, but in this case, I'm going to talk more about. There's a little bit of overlap, but I'm really going to talk more about the mistakes I see people make in their decisions about what to present and in how much detail for their research. So I think this is particularly specific. I don't want to necessarily talk about how to give a great presentation. I want to talk about how to present your research results. So,
okay. But there is a little bit of overlap because it's about communicating your ideas effectively to your target audience.
That's true. That is very true. You're right.
Yeah.
And you'll see a lot of the things I say have to do with doing that, especially to this particular audience. So I think it's really important because, underlying all this is anybody who loves to do research like this, user research, customer research, like I do. You want, you do all this work and you want your work to be used. You want it to have impact and influence. And so I think sometimes we concentrate a lot on the planning and conducting of the research and the analyzing of the data. And then we maybe don't give enough time to this question of how to present it to the people who asked you to do it.
Right.
So, you ready to dig in?
I am.
I thought I would start with the common problems and mistakes I've seen teams make or people make when they do this as a way to start the conversation.
Okay.
So, and this is not in any particular order necessarily, but I think that people make mistakes around how much detail they share. Because you have all this data, and sometimes, depending on the kind of research you did, you have a ton of data, right? You have 32 interview questions, and you interviewed 20 people.
Well, and I think this we see this a lot also when people are presenting at conferences. Yeah. And they think that what's important is they have to give each really smart idea, and if they don't give if it's not completely chock full of really, really, really awesome ideas, then they've like done it wrong.
Right.
And perhaps what would be more effective is just to focus on a few small points.
A few key ideas. Yes. But I think, I think the mistake I've seen people make about presenting their research is actually there's two extremes. One is they provide too much detail. So they have all this data and they have tables and charts and statistics, and 20% of the people did this and 32% did that. And then the opposite that I see is that they don't have enough detail. So they're just giving their insights and recommendations, but they're not showing any of the data.
So it's not necessarily that it's not enough detail. It's more that they are not backing up their conclusions.
Yes.
With evidence. Do you think that's a better way to word that?
Yeah, I do. But so I think how much you should go into the actual research data depends on who you're speaking to. So here's some advice about that. So if you've been collaborating with, let's say you have 2 or 3 stakeholders, right? Mm-hmm. And you've been collaborating with them on this throughout the whole project. Like they were in at the beginning, and they were in on the methodologies you were going to use, and they were in on the questions you were going to ask, and they were in on the recruiting the participants and so on. Mm-hmm. If they've been involved in detail all along, you might be able to err on the side of slightly more detail with them because they'll understand the context of it. But if you are delivering this presentation to people who perhaps funded the research but haven't been in on all the decisions, you're just going to overwhelm them if you start giving them too much data, and they're going to glaze over. So
can we talk a little bit more about exactly the types of positions that people might find themselves in? So because you were talking about like who is this advice for? Where, what, how do you know who your stakeholders are?
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
And this is a really important question, because another problem that I see, well, yeah, you definitely have to know who your stakeholders are. You have to know how much they do or don't know about the project, how much they do or don't know about the methodology. Are they experts at card sorting, or do they have no idea what a card sort is?
But how do you even know, right? Because we're talking about stakeholders.
Yeah.
How do you know who you need to convince? Or you're in a room of there's been a project you've been assigned, and now you're explaining the results of the project to a number of people in the room.
You need to know, you need to have talked to the stakeholders, or at least a stakeholder, before you started the project.
But how? You shouldn't even. But again, how do you know?
Well, who asked you to do the project?
Okay.
I mean, somebody asked you to do this project, or somebody's coming up with the money for the project.
So,
right?
Well, let me give you an example. The project has come down on your team, and your boss told you to do the project, but you're not presenting to your boss. You're presenting to the bosses, to someone else.
I know. So you need to go to your boss or whoever gave you this project, and you need to say, can we talk about this project and who is going to get the results of this and who I'm going to be presenting to when it's all done. And I would do that before I even do the project. But if for some reason you didn't do that, you need to do it now before you present. You have to know who's going to be in the room. You have to know who your primary stakeholder is, who that one person is that you have to make look good in the room. And you have to know something about your audience. I mean, you shouldn't give a presentation of anything to anyone if you don't know anything about your audience. I mean, that's just going to be, maybe if you're a really famous star, you can do that. I don't know. But that's just kind of a recipe for unhappiness.
Well, I only bring it up because sometimes when you're saying this kind of stuff, you have a natural knack for knowing a room, reading a room, knowing who your target audience is, even thinking in that way. And I don't think that's how a lot of people go about their daily lives.
I know. And I don't think it's a natural knack. I think it's called, that's what I've learned to do to be a great presenter, or to be at least comfortable with presenting. Yeah, you have to know who your audience is, what their frame of reference is, what their point of view is. And that's like one of the most important things, because one of the things I was going to say about, giving your presentation is you've got to give, usually you have research results, right? You have your data, you analyze the data, and then from that you come up with insights, right? Mm-hmm. You kind of come up with higher level insights about the data. And then from that, you would come up with recommendations for what should be done about it. Okay? So you've got the data, the insights, and the recommendations. And when you get to the part about the insights and the recommendations, you need to be talking about that from the stakeholder's point of view, not your point of view. So for instance, you may get some data. Maybe you did a user test, okay? And you got some data that said the form is really hard to use, that there's kind of weird things you did in the design of the form that mean that people are confused and they're not filling it out accurately, or they're not even finishing, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have your data about what happened. You have your insights. If you frame your insights in terms of this form is hard to use, and therefore you need to change, your recommendation is change the label here, change the button here, group things differently so that it'll be easy to use. That's your frame of reference as a usability, user experience person. That may mean nothing to a stakeholder. They're like, okay, sure, why? Why is this important? So you have to be able to talk about why the problem with the form is something they should care about. Why would they care about the problem with the form? Oh, because people are making errors, and those errors are costly because why? Why are those errors costly? What's the bottom line to them? What's the bottom line to the company or the organization? You've got to be able to, is it because people are putting errors in and that means that the appraisal amounts on the real estate are wrong and we're losing money? Or does that mean that further on down the line the data has to be corrected and that takes time and money? Or what, and you can only make that translation if you understand what the frame of reference is for the stakeholders. And that's going to be, I think, this idea of being able to present your data according to the frame of reference of the stakeholders is one of the biggest things in terms of making sure that your research results will be influential. And I think it's so easy, it's just so easy especially if you're like a user experience professional, or you just think about it from your point of view, and I think you also just kind of either you assume that of course you'd want to fix that form because you just should, or maybe you make the leap. If we fix the form, then we won't have errors. If we won't have errors, we won't waste time and money. But you don't make that connection. You just think everybody knows that, but not everybody is thinking that way because they're not usability or UX people. So you've got to draw that line. You got to make those connections. So that's a really important part. Let's see, what else? Here's an interesting one. A little subtle but really important. So a lot of times when you're giving your presentation to a couple people, afterwards, they're going to need to report up the line or out. They need to report this information and the recommendations and the insights to their management or to the development team or to a colleague, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to, you need to know that too. So when you're putting together your presentation, is this just for the people that are in that room? Or are they going to turn around and use this with other people? So if they're going to turn around and use it with other people, it's got to fit for those people too. Or maybe you want to do and you should help them. You should give them, and you should say, look, I'll give you this preliminary presentation to this group, and then if you're going to present to other groups, let's work together to put together a presentation deck that you can use.
Right.
Because otherwise they end up taking notes and trying to put together a presentation, and they get things wrong, or they don't have what they need, and
so
don't do a good job, and therefore the research is discounted.
So would you say that a good summary of that is that when you're presenting, what you're really doing is you are transmitting information to another person, and the goal is for you to give them the tools so that they can then transmit that information to other people?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. You would say that's fair.
Yeah, and otherwise it's kind of like the telephone game,
Mm-hmm.
where you say it to them, they didn't hear it quite right. They turn around and say it to someone else, but now it's starting to get garbled. Okay? Yeah. And so that I think is really important too. Okay. Let's see. Here's something I see. Here's a problem I see people do. They do a data dump. So they just take the results, right? Here's what happened. Here's the information from the card sort. Here's the tasks and what people did from the user test. Here's the click-through data. And they just kind of hand it over. And they don't do those steps of the insights and the recommendations afterwards. So you don't want to do that. You want to interpret the significance of the data before instead of just handing it over. And even if you're going to do, maybe you're going to do a written report with tables and charts and data and all of that, there are some people, I've worked on projects where whoever was bringing me in said, so then you'll create a written report and give it to us. And there was no presentation planned. I'm just supposed to, no, really, yeah. This happens a lot. I'm just supposed to give them the report. And it's like, no. You should, even if you give a report, you should really push to give a presentation about the report. Because you don't know if anyone's going to read it, or if they didn't understand it, or it's just different than being there in person.
So, okay, so if you want to kind of summarize, then what would you say is the best way to kind of figure out what the expectations are ahead of time, if that's possible? Or figure out, because I have some advice.
Oh, I have lots of advice, but tell me your advice.
Well,
we'll see if we overlap.
I think, I think a big part of it has to do how long is the meeting.
Yes, that's a really good point. And I think that sometimes, I think and I am thinking of one project we worked on together, and maybe you're thinking about the same one. I think sometimes you may not know how long the meeting needs to be until, you've tackled some of the analysis. But, when I'm working with a client, I'll tell them, we'll plan ahead for a 2-hour meeting to go over the results. But then sometimes as we're going through it, maybe it's like, okay, actually, I don't think it'll need 2 hours, or maybe it needs more, right? Although I think a 2-hour meeting is about as long as you want to do. If it needs more, you probably should do the first 2-hour meeting and then figure out where to go from there. But I think you should
But a lot of times you get half an hour, 15 minutes.
Oh, if you only get half an hour or 15 minutes, yeah, that's an interesting problem. Because then you're talking about you are just presenting high-level insights and recommendations. And in fact, in that kind of scenario, I would probably do the insights and a few recommendations and tell them I have more recommendations for them and how do they want them.
Yeah.
Because that's not, I mean, I'm sure there's some kind of research that maybe you could summarize in 15 minutes, but that's going to be tough.
Because sometimes, if it's a high-level person.
Yeah.
Or like there's a couple people presenting and it's a half an hour meeting. And sometimes you only get like 5 minutes.
That's very true. So in that case, all right, so here's another thing I want to say that I think is important in that case, but important in any case. You want to tell a story. I'm big on stories.
You?
So we know that there is research that shows that the brain understands information best when it's presented in a story format. And there are so many ways you can tell stories when given a presentation like this. So for instance, you could tell a story about doing the research. You could say, well, there was this problem with the such and such product, and they were getting a lot of abandonments of the shopping cart, and they tried some things to fix it, but they were still getting abandonments, and they wondered what the heck's going on. So they contacted us, and then we came in and we suggested they do a research study on right, and you just tell it as a story. Here was the problem. Here are the characters. Here's what they did. Here's the solution they came up with. Here's what we found out. And it's much more interesting that way if you tell it like a story. And then you can also tell a story. For instance, let's say you're whether it's a user test or card sorting or whatever it is, you could say, well, okay, here's a typical. Let's take a look at what participant number 3 did, because a lot of participants took the same route. Here's what he did. He went to this page and said that he was confused by this. So then he clicked here, and then he clicked. Now you're telling the story of what he did, and as an example of what most of or several of the participants did. So anything you can do to tell a story will be really helpful. And if you did something like user testing, I really encourage people to use highlight videos, so you can show video of the person doing it, because that's a story too. I've, as a tangential aside, I found a research article just yesterday that showed that if you ask people which way a story would be more engaging, like if they heard it auditory, or if they watched it through a video, which way do you think most people said it would be more engaging?
Probably video.
Yeah, but they hooked these people up to biometric measurements like heart rate and things like that. And people were more engaged, they could tell through the biometric measurements, with audio than video. Isn't that interesting?
It's very interesting.
So I'm bringing that up because although I think highlight videos are great, you don't necessarily need them. But it is why you need a presentation, because they have to hear this, not just read it.
Right.
They have to hear it. Okay, so stories. I think stories are really important. You want to take a shot at what else is important? Anything else you can think of?
Important.
Yeah, that would help your presentation be more impactful in terms of research results.
So we're talking specifically about research results.
Yeah.
Maybe it might be useful to actually get away from what like industry norms are. Does that make any sense?
Give me an example.
Well, so, when I'm talking about something that's like economicsy or something, right?
Economicsy?
Economicsy. Sometimes I'm going to bring up, there are certain ways that the industry talks about stuff.
Yeah.
That are technically accurate.
Yeah.
But if I'm giving the presentation to people who are perhaps not like, super literate.
They don't have a degree in economics.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll say stuff that is not technically accurate, but in order for to make it easier to understand what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah. I mean, I think this goes back to what I was saying before, like frame of reference, Mm-hmm. So I might have done a user test, and based on the results, I want to talk to them about the fact that they are not following standard UX industry practice of, right, where the labels are placed, or right.
Mm-hmm.
But if I start going off on this stuff, about in UX terminology, and maybe that means they're not going to follow me, right, and they won't know what I'm talking about. But on the other hand, though, to kind of give the other side of that, I mean, I don't know. You've probably noticed, and yeah, I think you've done the same thing. When we give presentations like this, I will purposely start talking about things like cognitive load, or right.
So you go the other way.
You do it too.
Oh, do I?
Yes, I remember you'll start talking about partitioning and framing, and behavioral economics principles, because
I guess it's a little different, because we're being brought in to be an expert and to sound smart and to
yes. That's true. That's true. We are. And so I think sometimes we bring that stuff in just so that we sound smart, so that we'll seem more credible, so that they'll listen to us and do what we say. But I think part of it too is education, and allowing people to think about. I think it's really important to go back and forth between high-level principles and detailed specific recommendations. So a lot of times I'm working with people, and they're just like, the stakeholders are like, and we had this experience recently where I thought, and this was an interesting experience for me, because they came back to us and said, can you give us some, just a list of the specific recommendations? And I thought to myself, we did that. Like, why are they asking for that? But when I looked back at the presentation, I realized we did give them specific recommendations, but it was peppered throughout these higher level concepts, right? So I would talk about consistency, and then we'd tell them a few things to do about consistency. And then we'd talk about, some other principle and tell them the few things to do about that principle. But we didn't have in one place just the 20 things they needed to change. And that's what they wanted. They were like, can you just boil this down? And so I think it's useful to do a little bit of education when you're doing these presentations, so that they do see the bigger picture, because I think that will help them talk about it. It'll help them realize that maybe, when they should bring you back in for another project.
Right.
But I think you also got to get down to the real details and just at some point tell them exactly what to do. Do this.
Yeah.
Why are you laughing?
Just because, sometimes I think clarity, you can't get any more clear than if you're like, what you should do is.
Yeah.
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 Those sort of like very like straightforward statements.
And hopefully before you do all that, you gave them, enough data that they know you're not just making it up.
Right. Or you have some level of credibility.
Here's one I've got for you.
Okay.
All right. So, and again, I know we have faced this in putting our presentations together for giving user research. So you've, in fact, I think you and I have had arguments about this, about, do you say nice things? Do you tell them what, so you you did a user test on their product and you have all these problems, right? You did a card sort, you did a tree test on their information architecture. There's all these problems. Now, there were a few things that worked out just fine and no one had problems with. So do you include those? Do you start with those? Do you just say, yeah, some things were good and we're not going to talk about them? What do you do with that?
Well, how much time do you have, right?
You mean in the presentation? Yeah, so if it's a really short presentation, you're thinking skip the things that worked?
I think so.
It depends. I mean, maybe everything worked, and although I've never seen that happen. But, but here's something interesting about that, Guthrie. And if you're going to skip the good things, you should tell them. There were lots of good things, we're skipping them. We're just going to focus on the problems. But I think all right, let's see. The problem I've seen is when you don't want to bury the lead or hide the punchline or whatever metaphor you want. So one of the problems I've seen is that people start the presentation with, well, let's talk about the things that worked. And then they spend the next, 10 minutes talking about all the things that worked or all the positive things the participants said in the interviews about the company, right?
Right.
And then, and now everybody's like in the room is getting very happy and feeling very good and everything's really wonderful. And now they turn and start talking about all the problems. And those are really, there's a lot of them and they're really bad. So I don't think that's a good idea. I think if there are lots of problems that you're going to talk about, you need to tell them within the first 60 seconds or less that there are lots of problems and you're going to talk about them. I think you've got to set that up so that they're kind of prepared for what you're going to say. And how strongly you do that depends on who's in the room and how much of their attention you want to get. And I think this is something, too, that you need to work with your, if you have a key stakeholder you're working with, you need to ask them. I remember I was working on a project and it was a user test. And the product was so bad and there were so many problems. And, it was a really dramatic user test. And there was pretty much nothing that worked well from a UX point of view about this software.
Well, that's great.
And there was just severe problems that were probably the most severe UX problems I've ever run a user test on. And so one of the things I did when I was analyzing the data was because I was going to be presenting this to a room full of people, and I had like one main stakeholder that I had been working with, and I didn't know most of the people in the room except for her. And I went to her and I said, okay, we need to talk about this because these problems are, there's a lot of problems and they're really severe. Do you want me to, back off on this? And how do you want me to present this? And you know what she said, literally?
What?
Hit him over the head. And she meant it. She was like, she knew there were problems. That's why she had brought me in. These people, were having a hard time believing her or wanting to do anything about it. And she wanted me to just drive it home. So I said, "You're sure you want this to be really strong?" She said, "As strong as you can make it." So I walked in and what did I say at the beginning? Something like,
"Y'all getting fired."
No, but you know how at the beginning of a movie, there'll be like warning, graphic images, images of violence, right? And I walked in and I said that to them, okay? I just opened it that way. I said, "Warning, this information is going to be shocking." And everyone just all of a sudden sat up really straight and their eyes got really big, But I wanted to grab their attention and I wanted them to know that this was going to be tough. That what they were going to hear was going to be tough. So I'm not suggesting that everybody do that. But if you do have a lot of bad news, you'd better go talk to your stakeholder about how they wanted that presented, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
I mean, that can be tough. So, any advice about how to best present really, really scientific data, like graphically versus visually versus?
Yeah, you mean if you've got to talk about, statistics and...
Yeah, so what happens if you have something really, really, that's going to be really tough?
Tough from an understanding point.
How do you even display it, right? You did 4 months of statistical analysis, and you're using, you use Python to create these scripts, and
yeah, I mean, you definitely, again, it depends on your audience, right? I mean, maybe they're used to thinking that way, and they're used to looking at, tables and charts and talking about p-values and all that, right? Mm-hmm. And then you'll be okay. But otherwise, you really have a couple of choices. One is, there's a whole art and skill to the visual display of quantitative data, right? And so I suggest that you definitely work on as many visual displays as you can that will be interesting and easy. And if you don't have that skill and it's a really important meeting, I suggest you bring someone in who can do that for you, because that's a particular skill and not everybody has it. So you may know that you need something, some way to visually show this data. But if you don't know how to do that, get an expert to help you. So I think that could be really important, is visually displaying it. Another thing is to decide how much you really need to show them. Like, can you just do a high level? Because even a good visual display, if you show, and here's the data at a high level, and then here's at this part, and then we parsed it this way and that way, and, by the 20th graph or pie chart or whatever, they're not following you anymore. So you really need to decide when you need to show it visually, when you need to even report on the data. I mean, one thing you can do is just say, I'm going to give you the highlights, and I have the data here. I've done that many times. I'll actually have a report with all the data in it ready to give them afterwards. That's not the same as the presentation I'm giving. So I think you got to think about dividing those two. You may have a detailed report with all the data, but your presentation is just the insights and recommendations. And they can peruse the detail if they want to. Or sometimes what I've also done is I've handed them the report, and then I'll say, in the presentation, I'll say, for instance, if you look at page 14, all the data about this is there. So the people who want to delve into that have it, and the people who don't know what it means don't have to look at it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's pretty good. So you can kind of structure it out in that way.
Yeah. I think the idea of this is the fancy term of progressive disclosure. Mm-hmm. The idea that you give people what they need at that moment, and then let them, if they want more, they'll go and get more. You make it, you arrange it that way so that, and that is also good if you have different people with different levels of interest or skill or knowledge. Then you're providing information for them, but not dragging everybody else through it all.
Right.
So I think that's useful too.
Okay. You want to talk just briefly about ROI stuff, or?
Yeah. So going back, this kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation when I was talking about the frame of reference, putting things in terms of the stakeholders' frame of reference. So, typically things that stakeholders, non-UX people who are often the ones funding these projects, the things that they care about, they care about the return on investment. So, what's the benefit of doing this research? What's the benefit of making the changes that you're suggesting? And, being able to, we've done a podcast episode on ROI, haven't we?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have.
So if you don't know what that means, you might want to go back and listen to that one. Being able to calculate the return on investment and being able to talk about it in terms of, things that matter to them. So for instance, if by making these changes that you're recommending, that means there'll be less calls to the help desk. If there's less calls to the help desk, that will save them, X number of dollars a month, or, you can do that calculation for them. So I think it's important to talk about things like ROI if that's what your stakeholders care about.
You got to talk. You got to talk in their language.
You got to talk in their language, right? So they're not necessarily interested in the information architecture and so on. They're interested in how much money can they save, how much more money can they make, how many hours of developer time can they save, how many, how much customer satisfaction can they increase. And that's, that whole idea about knowing ahead of time about what is important to them.
Right.
They're also often interested in, I call it a go or no-go decision, So if this is a prototype and we did the test, are we ready to go?
So what are the next action steps?
Yeah, or I can't tell you how many times I've done my entire presentation, and it's always a high-level person in the room will look at me and say, "So what's our grade? What do we get?" No, and they're totally serious. They want to know, and I swear there are some people where that is all they wanted. If I could have just walked into the room and said, "You got a B+," that's all they needed to know. They just want to know, is it good enough? Are we okay? Do we just stay the course? Or do we have a disaster on our hands and we need to do something? That's really what they want to know. Because if it's good to go, then they're good to go, and they just turn to their team and say, go. If it's a disaster, then the only thing they're going to do is turn to the leader of the team and say, fix it, right? So that's all they need to know, right? Go or no go. So, if that's what your stakeholder, and then again, this is the kind of thing you preferably know ahead of time, that's what they want to know. Or maybe what they want is just an answer to one important question, like, do people care? Does showing the amount of commissions that people have earned in the last year, does that motivate them to use the product more? Yes or no, right? They just they have one question they really wanted answered. So make sure you've answered that one question.
Right.
Or make sure you've talked about how, your insights and recommendations affect that one question. Because that's what they care about.
So you're just responding to your audience in the right way, right?
Yeah. You're just making sure you're really speaking to what your audience cares about. Definitely.
Very cool.
Yeah. So you got any other questions about doing these kinds of presentations?
I don't know. I don't think so. Do you have
any other comments that you want to bring up? I have one more.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it.
I think you should always include what the next piece of research is they should do. Because, research is so wonderful, and in my opinion, rarely do people do enough of it, that I don't want to miss the opportunity to say, this is great, and we got this great data, and, what you might want to consider moving forward is, maybe they should do a user test. Maybe they should test again in 6 months. Maybe they should do a card sort, maybe, right? I mean, what is the next piece of user research that would be really good for them to do, and suggest that at the end of your presentation. Because they may think you did user research, like you did all there was to do. They may not realize that, there could be more. Testing with a different set of users, testing in another country, or, whatever it is. So I think you should always recommend another thing that they could do as a next step.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. You would imagine that you're basically just selling.
You're selling the user research to them. Yeah, education and selling never ends. All right, Guthrie. So, do you think the next time you have to put together a presentation for user research results to stakeholders, you'll do any of this stuff?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe. It's possible.
It's possible. Okay. Hey, we love user research.
Mm-hmm.
And if people have questions about this or anything else, Guthrie, they should contact us at...
info@theteamw.com.
Yeah.
Is where to find us.
Anything else we have to tell people? We have a lot of exciting stuff coming up, but it's not released yet, so we're not going to talk about it yet. How's that?
I like that. It's very...
I'm hoping... Well, I was thinking the next podcast we do, it might be a few podcasts from now, because I know there's things you don't necessarily want to talk about until we're the new product is out.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So we have some new products coming out shortly. We'll keep you in suspense.
Yeah, it'll be a month or two yet.
Yeah. Contact us if you have any questions, and please subscribe to our podcast, and thank you for listening.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for the podcast, and I hope everyone has a great week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Guthrie. Bye.